As I said, like the last lecture, I gave this lecture yesterday, and at the end of it I realised that I hadn't pressed record, so the plan is today that I'll do this again, and I'll record it for other people, because other people who weren't there and aren't here, and then put it up, and then I'll try and go through it a bit more quickly than I did yesterday, and then I'll move on to the lecture I was going to do today. So I understand that most of you here are here for like a couple of hours. I won't talk at you for a couple of hours, I promise. I'll try and do like sort of two bits, maybe we can have a break in the middle, bit of a chat or something. So, okay, I don't need to say that tomorrow's lecture is not in Christchurch, because here we are, not in Christchurch, in Rotorua. So, just to recap on the last lecture that you would have seen, we looked at the Treaty of Waitangi and various attempts by Māori to get some kind of legal and political attempts to get it recognised and upheld. We then looked at the official policy of assimilation and some aspects of the early history of Māori schooling, and ended with a discussion of the urban drift of Māori, which was sort of urban drift, but make sure this is still crikey. That was this is okay, try that again. That was sort of urban drift, but was also encouraged as well. So today what we'll look at is the beginnings of this what I call the crisis in Māori education, and end with some examples of explanations of why Māori have been underachieving in education. So I ended the last lecture talking about this situation in the 1950s, that if you looked at the surface, it looked like things were calm, but that Māori were in a situation where this new generation that had come into the cities were in employment, but they were on the lowest rung, of the workplace. But for living standards were still better than they were previously for all of New Zealand, including Māori. The connection between Māori during this period, for this new generation coming into the cities and the workforce, the pub, the sports field, the army, these were the sorts of places where Māori and Pākehā mixed for the first time. As I said, Christchurch was a really white city, like 0.4% Māori, and then this new group of Māori came in, and the Pākehā had not been used to Māori being there, and Māori were arriving in an alien context, and these were the places where they met. And then there was this is the context of that Tony Bowker quote about all of his mates, and pointing out that there was no antagonism, that there was no political demands, there was no separatism, no mention of the treaty. But the absence of protest and people and things being done together didn't mean that that all was well. I mean, this was the situation where in Christchurch, and as I found out from my mother, all around the country, there was this 10 Little Niggers play being put on that was supposed to be kind of, normal family entertainment. Also, during this period, the impact of assimilation was really starting to bite. We had the situation where Māori parents who were trying to get ahead in this new alien urban setting, in this Pākehā context, who were steering their kids away from things Māori. They were steering their kids away from things Māori because this was the way to get ahead. This is what Māori parents thought was the way for their kids to get better opportunities. And so what you had was a whole generation. You had the generation that arrived in the cities, and you had the generation that they raised, that first generation that they raised in the cities, who were who were completely dislocated. Most of these migrants who moved in were focused on getting ahead for getting the kids getting ahead, and they saw the Pākehā world, succeeding in the Pākehā world is the way to do that. And so they didn't pass on the Māori ways. A lot of those people were themselves fluent in te reo, for example. They didn't pass it on to their kids. So their kids missed out on that. But then they went along and got involved in the schooling system, and they missed out on that too. They were unable to succeed in that too. So they ended up kind of slipping through the cracks of both worlds, and ended up with no education and with being dislocated from their Māori side. The vast majority of these people ended up with no understanding of te reo Māori at all. Like most Māori of my age, if they speak te reo Māori, they have done the hard yards and grafted away learning that as an adult, which is really, really hard work. They didn't grow up speaking it, even though in a lot of cases their parents did speak it. So this is the sort of the end of the 1950s we're talking about, and we move on to 1960. I want to start with 1960, which is an interesting year. Harry Everson referred to it as a watershed year for racism in New Zealand. And you look at a number of different things. One of them was no Māoris, no tour. I mean, it's not that long ago, and that was the birth of the anti-apartheid movement in New Zealand, that the rugby union was going to tour South Africa. South Africa said, oh, we've got this apartheid thing, so would you mind leaving the Māori players behind? And the New Zealand Rugby Union said, oh, okay, yeah, all right, we will. So they did. So they seriously did. They seriously did. So the birth of the anti-apartheid movement was really just saying, God, you can't be serious. That, like, to not offend the South African way of doing things, we're going to have no Māori in the team. But that's what happened. That is actually what happened. So this is 1960. The other thing which happened in 1960 was there was this visit to New Zealand by a guy called David Ausubel. And he was an American, white American, a Fulbright scholar. And he was over here. He's an anthropologist coming to look at New Zealand and look at New Zealand culture and New Zealand society. And he wrote a book, published a book in 1960 called The Fern and the Tiki. And The Fern and the Tiki was his kind of assessment of where New Zealand was at. And his overall conclusion was that New Zealanders were deluded about the society that they lived in. And particularly they were deluded with this notion that they lived in a society that was a model of racial harmony. The curious thing is that at the same time as they were saying this, they were also sharing with him, thinking that as a white American he would agree with them, the most outrageously racist comments about Māori. We're not racist, but this is sort of what they're like. There's always some truth to the stereotype, that kind of thing. So he said, on the subject of Māori, many Pākehā assumed shared views, emitting a tirade of venom and abuse that made the position of most American segregationists seem moderate by comparison. It shocked him. It shocked a white American coming from America in pre-civil rights days of the 1950s. He said the most striking impression American receives of race relations in New Zealand is that although they are generally much better than in the US, they're not nearly as good as people think or claim they are. He went on to refer to what he called the national delusion, which blocks recognition of the existence of a problem and thereby renders impossible the adoption of appropriate preventative and remedial measures. So you can't fix the problem, you can't address it if you don't even acknowledge that it exists. And he was able to find nobody, he swears, nobody in government or professional life who was prepared to publicly concede that a problem of race relations existed in New Zealand. So this is what he wrote in 1960. He was roundly dismissed and accused of being a meddling American who didn't know what he was talking about and so on. People really did not like what he said. But I thought that's an interesting kind of starting point. So I just want to sort of set out where we're going with the rest of these lectures in terms of how these things go. And basically what we're doing is if we take that starting point of we've seen how we got, how that sort of situation is created for the 1950s and so on, and then we look at the 60s and right through to now. So the 60s I've called the decade of reality check. This is the period when the myths started to come unstuck and people started to realise that actually there was some serious things that needed to be addressed. The 1970s are called the emergence of radicalism, because this was really the time when Māori, in particular Māori political aspirations and objectives and the methods that were used took on a whole new radical turn. The 1980s was the period when those radical, shocking ideas that were being pushed by small groups of activists in the 1970s came to be recognised as having some merit, so much so that even the mainstream establishment could no longer ignore them and dismiss them. The 1990s was the decade of settlements, of negotiations and agreements between Crown and claimants, treaty claimants, for settlements to compensate Māori for the losses incurred after the treaty. And then the 2000s is the decade of the backlash against this whole process, and I think it's that messy cauldron of backlash is the period that we're currently in. So I said the 60s was the period of reality check. At the same time as people were telling David Ausubel to keep his nose out and he didn't know what he was talking about and so on, Jack Hunn, who was the head of the Department of Māori Affairs, I don't know what the actual term was, but that's what it was, the government department dealing with Māori affairs, had been asked to do a report of the state of Māori in New Zealand. And this was released, written in 1960, published in 1961. It's called the Hunn Report. And the Hunn Report was the first official kind of statement or recognition that things were not all rosy. And so it ended this era of optimism. It ended the era where it was assumed that things were fine, because it revealed that Māori were in an appalling situation in every social measure, every important social measure that was examined: housing, health, education, and so on. The Hunn Report in education spoke of a statistical blackout in education, looking at the differences between Māori and non-Māori in these areas. So it was a serious statement about how bad things were. What was the solution to these problems? Well, Hunn's report, and Hunn basically recommended that what was required was more of the same. Seriously, more of the same was what was required. So what was needed was greater urban migration of Māori to hasten integration. So that process that had caused all that dislocation was seen as something that there needed to be more of. Migration, Hunn said, was seen as the quickest and surest way of integrating the two species of New Zealand. It's a curious turn of phrase, but this was what was being recommended: more of this, more urbanisation, more migration. So the Hunn Report led to the official policy of assimilation being replaced with one of integration. Not a whole lot of difference there, except that integration is defined as combining, not fusing, the Māori and Pākehā elements to form one nation wherein Māori culture remains distinct. So up until that point, the official objective had been that Māori culture and society would literally sort of fizzle out and dissolve into nothing, so that there would just be one New Zealand society where Māori would be kind of invisible within it. So the Hun report was the first sort of recognition that elements of that society might be preserved. But it was still very much the society was, the Pākehā-ness of society was assumed. And Māori were expected to just fit in and go along with that. And here's another quote from the Hun report. He said, "Here and there are Māoris who resent the pressure brought to bear on them to conform to what they regard as a Pākehā way of life. It is not in fact a Pākehā, but a modern way of life, common to advanced people in all parts of the world. Full realisation of this fact might induce the hesitant or reluctant Māoris to fall into line more readily." So it wasn't that this was Pākehā society that was dominant, it was just the way society kind of is. It was just modern society. This was just assumed as the normal way things would be, and the expectation is that Māori needed to just get with the program and learn how to function in this world, that this was the most important thing. And in that context, education played a very important role. In fact, Hun said that education is the one thing more than any other that will pave the way to further progress in housing, health, employment and acculturation. Interesting word of acculturation. If you're supposed to retain your culture, acculturation means being disconnected from your culture. That was what the objective was. School, Hun said, is the nursery of integration. Children mix naturally where their less adaptive elders stand apart. So urban migration and mixed schooling was the key to this process of Māori getting with the program and being able to be taught to be like Pākehā and function in a Pākehā world. And one of the things that came out of this was the end of the Māori schools that had started as the native schools. So in the a few years after, in the decade that followed, in the 1960s, in the decade of the 60s, the Māori schools ended. So I just want to talk about two aspects of what was going on here. The first one, which is a very, very significant one, was the crisis in Te Reo Māori. That one of the impacts that the education system was having was the weakening of Māori language. Now, as I've mentioned before, this happened in multiple ways. Part of it was through the formal restrictions on language that, you know, as I've said before, in the native schools, Māori was forbidden to be spoken and all the rest of it, and there's all sorts of horror stories about that. But also, more importantly, it came through Māori parents internalising that. Māori parents accepting this dominant view that Te Reo Māori was an obstacle to success in education, and that unless they succeed in education, they weren't going to get ahead in society. So Te Reo Māori and Māori culture, Māori way of being was for Māori parents who had aspirations for their kids, was something that they should steer them away from. And that generation that came, the first generation that came to the cities, lots and lots of them were doing that. They weren't forced to do that, but this is the way society had developed. This is the situation that they've been in, isolated in a Pākehā environment, and in order to function in that environment, they made those decisions, you know, as every parent does, from what they see as the best interests of their kids. And it's interesting when you think about that, you know, all that previous era when I was talking about those theories of colonisation and so on, and how do you get from a situation where you've got tens of thousands of British troops shooting men, women and children and destroying crops and imprisoning people and taking land and all that resistance against that, and how do you get to that point where that sort of more hegemonic, that concept of hegemonic situation where Māori have internalised this colonial situation, and to the point where they're not resisting against it, they're actively encouraging their own children to move away from it. This is the power of how colonialism can work. And you're talking about, you know, less than 100 years where that transformation takes place, the way those power dynamics operate, and you can see clearly how, and we'll give you some more examples, how education reinforces that whole process. So, in terms of Te Reo Māori, the 1970s was a real wake-up call. A guy called Richard Benton from the New Zealand Council for Educational Research published some research which confirmed what activists talking about this at the time, about what was going on with Te Reo Māori. Because what had happened was that all these, the people who had moved to the cities, there was just this kind of assumption when that they moved to the cities, they were thinking about their kids getting ahead. There was just an assumption that what they moved away from would still be there, except so many people left that they left those communities impoverished and broken down and isolated and in really kind of decrepit state in a lot of cases. And what Richard Benton's research identified was he looked at these, what are called the, broadly recognised as criteria, sort of warning things for language extinction. Languages become extinct, like, you know, plants and animals become extinct. They're becoming extinct every day. There are lots of really endangered languages around. And these are the three criteria for a language being in trouble. The first one is that the speakers lack a secure geographical base. That is an actual physical place where the language is predominantly spoken, where it's the dominant language. The second one is where the speakers of this language, this endangered language, are fewer in number than the speakers of the dominant language. And the third one is where the foreign language, the powerful language, has greater prestige and access to power. And what Benton argued and documented was that on all of these three serious warning signs for Te Reo Māori, it was in very serious difficulty. By the mid-1970s, when his research was published, Te Reo Māori had ceased to be a language for socialising children. So it wasn't the language that parents used with their kids, even just little stuff around the house, like, you know, shut the door and it's time for bed, and you know, all the just sort of basic instructions around the house. Māori parents were speaking in English to their kids in the homes. It was a majority language only in a very few isolated areas. There's maps, he's done a map of this, I should have put it up there. Tiny little dots around the country where the places, the actual physical places where Te Reo Māori was the majority language. Those who did speak Māori tended to speak it only in formal occasions on the marae. And importantly, the speakers Te Reo Māori were older and were dying faster than they were being replaced. I think from memory what he said was that only 15% of speakers of Te Reo Māori were under 15 at this point, and half the Māori population was under 15. It's a very young population because of low life expectancy and so on. So this was a formula for some really serious stuff. Really serious stuff. The language was endangered. I mean, the people who spoke it were older and were dying. It wasn't being used in the home. All of those danger things were there, and the significance of this is huge. You know, as I've mentioned before, if any of you speak another language, the language is such an essential element of a culture, of a whole identity. I mean, it's right up there with land. Land and language are sort of two key elements. I mean, language carries, it isn't just words for communicating things, it's concepts that are peculiar to the language. Certain ways of thinking and expressing oneself that are an essential part of the language. And as we've talked about, as I mentioned before, language is this critical element of culture, and culture is sort of the last line of defence in that colonial process. And you remove the land, you wipe out the language, you destroy the culture, and there's effectively nothing left when you get to that point. You've got sort of total control. So Māori society was in this, had a real major scare in the 1970s, staring down the barrel of language death and all of that meant for Māori culture. So that was sitting there, that language crisis was sitting there, and at the same time there was this education crisis that was emerging as well, and that's just getting, you know, that was really bad. The Māori were consistently underachieving in comparison with other groups. There's been a bit of catch-up, but even today, you know, the latest stats show 82% of Pākehā passing NCA level 2, compared with just over 61% of Māori. That is still a big gap that is here today, and that gap has actually closed some. So, you know, you go back a decade or two or three, and you've got an even wider gap, and all of the implications of that gap being entrenched in society for all that length of time. I've mentioned before this long tail, that if you look at international comparisons, New Zealand performs educationally reasonably well in comparison with other countries, but what that conceals is the distribution of New Zealand achievement. Because New Zealand has got a group of high achievers, but it's got a long tail of underachievement, and Māori are overrepresented in that long tail of underachievement. So how did this all happen? How did this all happen, and what education had Māori been getting during the 20th century? I've got a few quotes here that will kind of give you an indication of what we're talking about here. The first one is from Bird, who was an inspector of native schools in the early part of the 20th century. This is what he said. So far as the education department is concerned, there is no encouragement given to Māori boys who wish to enter the learned professions, doctors, lawyers, teachers, so on. The aim is to turn, if possible, their attention to the branches of industry for which the Māori seems best suited. So what the education system was trying to do for Māori was to give them the sort of education that would be most useful for them. And so what do? They say, well, what sorts of positions do Māori occupy in society, and how do we prepare them for that? And it's a real, I'll show you a couple, it's a really good example of how education reproduces the way society operates. And it still functions, perhaps not quite so blatantly, but education, wherever you look at it and whatever period you look at it, tends to reinforce and reproduce the existing power structures in society. Now, those of you who are going to be teachers, you know, you go to teach because you've got idealistic ideas about changing the world, and you can as a teacher. You can do a lot to change all sorts of things in society, in your professional life and beyond. But the cold hard reality is that overall, over time, just about everywhere you look at it, education tends to have the effect of reproducing social inequalities. And this is a really good illustration of it. So T.B. Strong, Director General of Education in 1931. What is this branches of industry for which Māori seem best suited, referred to above? The aim of education for Māori was to lead the Māori boy to be a good farmer and the Māori girl to be a good farmer's wife. This is the 1930s, when still very rural situation. So Māori boys and girls are going to grow up being farmers and farmers' wives, so we need to give them an education that will be suitable for their this future life they have. 1941, Senior Inspector of Native Schools Fletcher says the curriculum of native district high schools should concentrate on homemaking in the widest sense, including building, construction and all its features, furniture making, metalwork and home gardening for the boys, and home management including cookery, home decorating and infant welfare for the girls. This is what Māori were going to be doing, and so this is the education that we should organise for them. Now, the interesting thing about this is that, now, as I said before, as scholars of sociology of education, we look at this, you know, we look back and we say, you know, what's going on here? These people are just being steered in towards a particular way of doing things. It's not helpful, as I've mentioned before, and I think we need to keep it in mind, when we look at things like that, to think in terms of kind of goodies and baddies. What we've got is we've got people who are making the decisions about education who are so convinced in themselves about, you know, education being all about European knowledge, Pākehā ways of doing things, and being and appropriate things for what everybody needs, that you know, they think they're giving the best education, this appropriate education. You know, this is a reflection of the dominant perspective of what was appropriate on the basis of ethnicity and gender. This is what the thinking of decision makers was. And so you can see in that. You can see in that the dominant views about gender roles, and I mean, there's gender elements in that, but there's lots of other examples of really gendered policies in the history of education, and you can see views about ethnicity in that as well. These are the dominant views of society. This was not education that was designed with the intention of repressing or marginalising people. It was designed with the kind of intention you know, it was basically just assuming the superiority of the Pākehā way of doing things. And it's interesting too, you look at those quotes, and this is a really, I think, interesting illustrations of Freire's idea that all education is political. These weren't policies that were kind of politicised at the time, but you look back and you can see they had a profound political impact on Māori society and on broader New Zealand society. I mentioned before this quote from Greg talked to you about Bibi a couple of times, right? Bibi was an interesting character. He was a senior civil servant, leading educational bureaucrat, and quite an interesting thinker. And this comment of his I really like, I want to share with you. He said a quarter of a century ago, in 1941, he wrote this in the 1960s, I sat in a Maori village in a remote corner of New Zealand, trying to persuade the chiefs and elders to accept for their district a secondary school providing the technical courses the area so clearly needed, rather than the classical course on which they had set their hearts, the classical academic kind of courses. What they were being offered was, in fact, an expensive type of school for a rural area. But their idea of an educated man was based on the Oxbridge graduates, that's Oxford and Cambridge graduates, who had come to New Zealand as missionaries a century before, and neither John Dewey nor an economist with his promise of productivity would have shaken them. I retired defeated when an old chief, having shrewdly elicited that I had myself taken Latin, clinched the argument and look where it got you to. Proper reply still eludes me. So there was, even back in the 1940s, Maori who had kind of recognised the connection between learning Latin and being in positions of wealth and power, and learning woodwork and metalwork and kind of staying where you are. And they were questioning him about this, and he had to admit he didn't really have an answer for it, because, you know, he didn't learn woodwork at school, did he? So the context for this crisis we see in the 1960s then was that we had an education system that was preparing Maori for a lowly status in society. There were low expectations on the part of the teachers and on the part of the Maori pupils themselves as to what those pupils were capable of. We had the complete marginalisation of all forms of Maori knowledge. They were just absent, totally absent as being anything that was worthwhile knowing or understanding. Of Maori was just nothing in the education system. And at the same time we had the severe weakening of traditional rural Maori society. And with all of those combining, putting Maori language into a situation where it was being pushed to the point of being endangered, of being potentially rendered extinct. And that is a really, really serious kind of inventory of the state of Maori society in the 1960s and the sort of challenges that were being faced by Maori in that context. And so, I think it's a really important that period of migration and kind of disconnection with Maori society and trying to fit into Pākehā society, and that's the context where a lot of urban Maori grew up in, and that was the situation, I think, where a whole lot of the damage to Maori culture and society took place. And again, just to sort of reinforce those things about how this thing operated, that by then it had got to the point where, you remember those quotes from Freire earlier about internalising a sense of inferiority and so on, and that kind of assumption of Pākehā society being the way it was, that all of these institutions are run by Pākehā, along Pākehā lines. Maori were aliens in these urban environments, and trying to fit in as best they could in isolated small units created a very, very difficult situation. And you're like having Adam here who can. I'm telling you this as somebody. We grew up in the same city, and I'm telling you this as somebody who was kind of oblivious to this sort of thing. The very kind of, you know, realities, the cold, hard, cliff-face realities of this is are things that you know, Adam will be talking to you about, or has been talking to you about, has experienced. So I ended this lecture by talking about some explanations for it, but what I might do is I might just stop there, and then I'll start the next lecture with this cultural deprivation theory.